What you are about to hear is not a movie. It is not a television drama. It is the kind of story that federal prosecutors describe in sealed courtrooms before the rest of the world is allowed to know the name of the person sitting at the center of it. All. Tonight, that name gets spoken out loud. At 3:47 in the morning, on a humid Tuesday in Miami, Florida, something happened that agents inside the FBI's Southern District Task Force would later describe as the single most significant domestic corruption takedown in the last 2 decades. Over 900 federal agents deployed across 18 simultaneous strike points stretching from Miami-Dade County to Fort Lauderdale to the coastal edges of Palm Beach, executed a synchronized operation that had been building quietly for 22 months. The target was not a street gang. It was not a mid-level cartel distributor. The target was a sitting mayor. The target was a $2 billion drug empire operating in plain sight, wearing a suit, giving press conferences, cutting ribbons at charity galas, and shaking hands with senators. And behind every handshake, behind every smile captured in a glossy newspaper photograph, was the Jung Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, one of the most violent and powerful criminal organizations on the planet. This is the story of how deep it went. And the deeper you go, the worse it gets. 3:47 a.m. Miami Beach. The Atlantic sat black and perfectly still. The neon lights along Collins Avenue reflected in long, silent streaks across the wet pavement. No tourists, no music bleeding out of rooftop clubs, just the kind of quiet that feels wrong when you know what is about to move through it. 14 black SUVs rolled without headlights down a private access road leading to a gated oceanfront estate in the Star Island neighborhood, one of the most exclusive residential addresses in all of South Florida. The estate belonged to Mayor Dominic Aurelio Reyes, a 2-term mayor of Miami, a man who had appeared on the cover of 3 regional business magazines in the last 5 years. A man whose re-election campaign had been funded by some of the most powerful real estate and hospitality lobbying groups in the state. The gate came down in 4 seconds. SWAT units in full tactical gear fanned across the manicured lawn like water moving through cracks. FBI breach teams hit the front entrance. ICE tactical units took the rear service access. DEJ operatives secured the dock and the private marina attached to the property where, sitting quietly in the water, were 2 modified offshore speedboats that federal agents would later determine had made 41 documented runs between Miami and the Yucatan Peninsula in the previous 14 months. Flashbangs detonated in the lower wing. Interior lights blazed on. Shouts of federal agents, "Do not move," echoed across marble floors and cathedral ceilings. Reyes was found on the 2nd floor. No resistance. The man who had stood at podiums and spoken about community safety and the rule of law sat on the edge of his bed in silence as agents placed him in restraints. But what the agents found in the basement of that estate, sealed behind a reinforced steel door disguised as a wine cellar, was the moment this investigation stopped being about one corrupt official and became something that would be discussed in congressional briefings for years. Inside that room, 4 encrypted server racks still running, 41 sealed case files, 68 burner phones in organized rows, and a single locked steel drawer containing what federal forensics analysts would later call the master ledger, a physical record of every cartel transaction, every bribe paid, every political favor purchased, and every shipment of narcotics coordinated through the mayor's private channels over a span of 4 years. The Chung cartel did not just have a contact inside Miami City Hall. They had an operator, and the operation had a name. By 6:15 that same morning, inside the FBI's Southern District Cyber Forensics Lab in Miramar, Florida, analysts had already cracked the first layer of encryption on the seized servers. What appeared on their screens was not just financial data, it was architecture. A full operational diagram, color-coded, layer-separated, and cross-referenced with routing timestamps that the federal team would formally designate as Project Shoreline. Project Shoreline was not a cartel side operation. It was a purpose-built infrastructure. Shell companies registered in Delaware, Panama, and the Cayman Islands formed the outer financial shell. Beneath that layer sat a network of 12 ghost corporations operating as hospitality management firms, 3 sham nonprofit foundations with active ears exemption status. A. Commercial logistics company operating refrigerated freight trucks up and down the I-95 corridor, and a luxury yacht charter business operating out of the Port of Miami that had never once appeared on a DIA watch list. The money moved in patterns. Cartel revenue generated from cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and large-scale human trafficking operations moving through South Florida was deposited in fragments into the hospitality shell companies. Those deposits were then layered through the nonprofit foundations as charitable grant distributions. From there, the cleaned capital re-entered the legitimate economy through real estate acquisitions in Miami-Dade and Broward counties. Properties were purchased. Properties were sold. And at each transaction point, Dominic Reyes's digital authorization signature appeared in the transfer chains. Not as a passive beneficiary, as an active architect. Federal analysts estimated total laundered capital flowing through Project Shoreline at $2.1 billion across 4 years of operation. That number was not a ceiling. Investigators believed it was a floor. Reyes had used his political position to funnel Xi cartel narcotics into South Florida at scale. The Port Authority inspection schedules had been manipulated. Way station maintenance windows on major freight corridors had been mysteriously synchronized with documented cartel convoy movements. 3 city contracts awarded to logistics firms in Reyes's final budget cycle were, according to federal investigators, wholly fabricated entities designed to move narcotics. Under cover of municipal freight contracts. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. This was not negligence. This was engineered treason. And the operation, agents quietly confirmed that morning, had only just entered its second phase. 5:58 a.m. The FBI's Regional Command Center, established overnight inside a hardened facility in Doral, Florida, looked like something out of a military war room. A massive digital display filled an entire wall, showing the South Florida coastline from Key West to Palm Beach, with red markers pulsing across it like a slow-beating pulse. 31 active target locations, each one connected by documented evidence to Project Shoreline. Each one a node in the Jang Cartel's South Florida network. The order was given at 6:02 a.m. Operation Full Execution. Go. Over 1,000 federal agents, including FBI tactical units, ICE Homeland Security investigations, DIA strike teams, SWAT elements from 3 jurisdictions, and DX Air. Support operating 3 Black Hawk helicopters along the coastline moved simultaneously against all 31 targets. In Hialeah, agents hit a commercial warehouse complex that had been operating as a narcotics processing and distribution center. Inside, they found 1.4 tons of cocaine, packaged and prepared for distribution across the southeastern United States. They also found 2.1 million fentanyl pills, compressed and vacuum-sealed in packaging designed to look identical to over-the-counter pharmaceutical products. 11 cartel members were taken into custody. 3 attempted to flee through a loading dock. They did not get far. In Brickell, federal agents executed a simultaneous raid on 3 luxury condominium units that had been used as cartel safe houses and cash storage facilities. Inside, they recovered $47 million in bundled U.S. currency, 300 kilograms of methamphetamine, and a communication server that was actively transmitting encrypted signal traffic to a CJNG coordination node in Guadalajara, Mexico. The server was running when agents entered. It was seized, still operating. In the Port of Miami, ICE maritime units boarded 2 commercial freight vessels flagged under Panamanian registry. Concealed within refrigerated cargo manifested as agricultural product, agents discovered 800 kilograms of heroin and an additional 600 kilograms of cocaine. The ship manifests had been digitally certified through a Port Authority account that federal investigators traced directly to a senior port operations supervisor who was taken into custody before noon. In Coral Gables, a residential estate used as a cartel communications hub and logistics coordination center was raided and found to contain a fully operational server farm, 12 encrypted satellite communication terminals, and physical records connecting the Kung Cartel's South Florida operation to distribution networks in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Washington, D.C. In 6 hours, the underworld took more damage than it had absorbed in the previous 6 years. As the raids concluded and the evidence flowed back into federal processing facilities, investigators working the internal corruption side of the case began pulling apart. Something even darker than the drug operation itself. Seized patrol logs from Miami-Dade and Broward County law enforcement databases revealed a pattern so deliberate and so systematic that veteran FBI investigators described it as unlike anything they had seen in domestic law enforcement infiltration. 43 law enforcement officers across multiple agencies had been identified as compromised on active cartel payroll at the time of their arrest. That number included 2 senior police sergeants, 1 deputy chief of a coastal city department, a federal customs officer assigned to Miami International Airport, and 2 county court clerks who had been altering warrant processing timelines to provide cartel-connected defense attorneys with critical advance notice before arrest warrants were executed. The cartel had not just bribed a few officers, they had built a parallel enforcement system, a second, invisible police force that operated inside the real one. Patrol grids in specific neighborhoods had been quietly redrawn, creating coverage gaps that coincided with documented cartel distribution hours. Internal raid schedules had been leaked at least 6 confirmed times, allowing cartel operatives to relocate before federal teams arrived. A confidential DIA informant embedded inside the CJing Miami network had been identified and killed 18 months earlier. Investigators now had evidence linking that identification to a leak that originated inside the very task force meant to protect him. Honest officers who had spent careers inside those departments sat in federal briefing rooms that afternoon with something past anger on their faces. What they were looking at was the institution they had served, the badge they wore, being used as a weapon against the people it was supposed to protect. One senior DIA agent, speaking to colleagues after reviewing the internal betrayal files, said simply, "We have to build it from the ground up, because what we had was already gone before we knew it." As federal analysts worked deeper into the Project Shoreline architecture, the scale expanded beyond Miami. What had looked like a South Florida operation began resolving into something continental in its design. The CJing cartel, under the operational protection and infrastructure provided by Reyes and his network, had established South Florida not merely as a distribution point, but as a secure headquarters for its entire eastern United States operation. The logistics company running refrigerated freight up the I-95 corridor had active contracts reaching into 14 states. The shipping lanes connected to cartel operations in the Gulf of Mexico allowed an estimated 4 to 6 tons of narcotics per week to enter South Florida without triggering standard interdiction protocols, because the protocols had been quietly adjusted by people inside the system who answered to Project Shoreline, not to their agencies. Agricultural import documentation from cartel-connected operations in Central America had been routed through Miami Customs using certification codes that had been compromised. 2 years earlier, way stations on 3 major Florida freight corridors had experienced coordinated maintenance shutdowns, documented in state records as routine infrastructure work, precisely timed to cartel convoy movement schedules. Human trafficking routes moving migrants through South Florida under the cover of legitimate agricultural labor contracting had been used to supplement cartel cash flows and to move cartel personnel across state lines without federal travel documentation flags. And buried inside the deepest file partition on the primary server seized from Reyes' Star Island estate, analysts found the final piece of what they would later describe in sealed federal filings as the Long-Term Stabilization Plan, a phased document authored over a period of 3 years, outlining how South Florida's political, financial, and law enforcement infrastructure would be progressively restructured through elections, through appointments, through contracts, through silence, to become a permanently sung, controlled operational zone. Not a region that the cartel had infiltrated, a region that had been redesigned from the inside to serve the cartel's future. The system was not compromised. It had been converted. Let that settle for a moment. Because this story is not ultimately about one mayor. It is not even about one cartel. It is about what happens when ambition and silence replace conscience inside the institutions that hold everything else together. Power does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with a handshake, a campaign donation, a zoning approval, a maintenance window on a way station, a quiet adjustment to a patrol grid, and by the time anyone looks closely enough to see what has happened, the architecture is already standing. The real cost of what Project Shoreline moved through South Florida is measured in families. It is measured in the fentanyl that reached neighborhoods from Miami to Atlanta to Charlotte, in the 2.1 million pills seized in that Hialeah warehouse, each one representing a potential overdose, a potential funeral, a potential child losing a parent before they understand what addiction means. It is measured in the people moved through human trafficking corridors, treated as logistics rather than human beings, their suffering used as revenue cover for a network that wore the face of a city government. This story is a warning, not a comfortable warning, but a necessary one. Political infrastructure is only as strong as the people inside it who refuse to be purchased, and the moment the refusals stop, the conversion begins. Mayor Dominic Aurelio Reyes faces federal charges including racketeering, drug trafficking conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting a designated foreign criminal organization. 43 law enforcement officers face internal criminal referrals. 31 cartel-connected locations across South Florida have been seized and shuttered. The Chung Cartel's Eastern United States Coordination Network has been disrupted at its command layer. But federal investigators were careful in their official briefings to use the word disrupted rather than destroyed. Because they know, as you now know, that networks like this do not end with one raid. They end when the silence around them ends. If you are still watching this, tap like so more people see this story. Share it with someone who needs to understand what political corruption actually looks like when it is operating at full scale. Comment the word expose if you believe that stories like this one need to stay in the public conversation regardless of who is uncomfortable with them being there.